Due Process, winner of 21 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights and the 2012 Mid-Atlantic Emmys for Outstanding Interview Special and Outstanding Discussion Series. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
I don't think nobody should be rejected. I mean rejected because you've been in jail. Like, if you coming home to do something different, I don't think the world should be scared of you.
But they are.
They are.
And that fear shows its face when ex-offenders look for work. So a movement's on to ban the box. The box applicants are asked to check if they've been convicted or sometimes even arrested. A controversial new bill on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
You apply for a job, fill out an application, and get to the critical question. Have you ever been arrested, convicted of a crime? Most of us can simply say no and move on, but 1 in 4 Americans have to check that box, and chances are that's the end of that job. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and that harsh reality has triggered a movement to ban the box, to erase that first barrier to employment. The fledgling bill is titled the Opportunity to Compete Act, because of realities like these.
1 out of every 3 African-American men can expect to be incarcerated during his lifetime. 1 out of every 17 white men, 1 out of every 6 Hispanic men. 65 million Americans have criminal records, nearly 1 out of every 4 adults.
And though their offenses may vary, the consequences differ, there are some things that they share, like trouble getting a job.
How you doing? I'm good. So I wanted to know if you had any applications, if you was doing any hiring. No? Okay. Thanks a lot. I have a hard time finding meaningful employment where I can pay my rent and, you know, put a couple dollars in the bank and buy
a real
food
full-time job.
Exactly. I haven't had one of those.
We have become, unfortunately, a revolving door of justice. And one of the ways to slow the turning of that door, if you will, is to have or to provide opportunities for ex-offenders to compete effectively in the workplace.
But if employment is key to combating the recidivism cycle, the argument is that something has to go. It's the question that appears on most job applications. Have you ever been arrested, convicted of a crime? The box that millions have to check, the one likely to close the door on their chances of being hired.
If you check that box, your application is frequently consigned to the circular file, a trash can.
If the box was banned, I'd be able to hold my head up a little higher. All you got to do is my references, my experience, and, you know, my work past or whatever. And that's
You'd have a job.
I believe I would. I believe I would.
Melvin Johnston's record has been clean for 6 years, but a string of stolen property offenses, that follows him still.
Newark, Lincoln Park.
How willing are you to accept an ex-offender in your establishment, knowing that you got stuff that could possibly come up missing too?
It's still important that you stress to them that you've done your time or you've served your time. You've been released, you're home, and this is what I'm trying to do now to get my life back on track.
Now, From what you learned about us today, you know my whole history, this and that, oh, he's stolen cars and stuff like that. Who would you want to hire?
And under the proposed legislation, that record would not be permanently off limits to an employer. But it could protect Johnston from the door being slammed in his face before he can even try to step through.
The New Jersey Opportunity to Compete Act simply postpones the criminal background inquiry.
Postpones it until the end of the process, until an offer of employment has been made. Then the record would be fair game.
It does not eliminate the box. It does not take away discretion or decision-making from the hands of business leaders, those charged with the responsibility of finding the very best people for the jobs.
Every corporation in the state wants to find the best employees that they can. Those that have the most skills, current skills, those that have a will to work.
I really never wanted to answer the question. And, you know, I would be afraid that if I answered it if I didn't answer, that they would find out and I would lose my job. Okay?
And if you did answer?
I wouldn't get hired. I wouldn't get hired.
It allows corporations to see those individuals who frankly have the skill sets and have the abilities, but otherwise would not have even perhaps been able to get in the front door for an interview. So that's an extraordinary positive.
And while business leader Al Coppi, who's headed both Bell Atlantic, New Jersey and PSE&G, is speaking out for the bill, even corporations who voluntarily banned the box don't seem anxious to talk about it.
I have a felony, and you're constantly thinking about that over and over again, like, I'm not going to get the job because of this, you know.
Both Horizon and Prudential declined requests for interviews. But in accordance with a City of Newark ordinance, they don't ask about criminal records until a conditional offer is made.
I think it'll make a big difference on an application, if it's not on an application going in. Because, you know, it'll give people like me, you know, a chance to at least have some type of hope without having that over your head.
And in most of these cases, they're being punished for things that happened when they were kids or 15 or 20 years ago. The only way that we're going to help this state economically is if we get people employed.
So Cunningham's primary sponsor in the Senate, Bonnie Watson Coleman in the Assembly.
That if you are black and brown and poor in the state of New Jersey, you're going to possibly have a run-in with the criminal justice system that will result in some blemish, something on your record.
And working with the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, their challenge is to get the box bill through both houses and past Chris Christie, whose office won't say which way he's likely to go.
It gets to the point where you understand that something more has to be done.
At least they had the opportunity to be considered, to move further along in the process, as opposed to day one, I'm automatically eliminated because I checked yes.
But is it wrong for business to judge an applicant by his or her record? Is it arbitrary bias, or is banning the box just a matter of basic fairness? And what happens to a society that imprisons millions who can't live on the outside once released if they can't get jobs?
Just a few of the questions we'll put to our panel. Cornell Brooks, President and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Eric DeGesero, Executive Vice President of the New Jersey Fuel Merchants Association and Executive Director of the Independent Electrical Contractors. And Dave Kerr, longtime Executive Director, now retired, of Newark's Integrity House, the oldest and largest drug rehab in the state. Welcome to all of you.
Well, thank you.
Cornell, I want to start with you in terms of the ban the box legislation. And the title of my question is it enough? But the gist of the question is, what is it we know about employment practices and human nature that makes us believe that moving the consideration of the criminal record to the middle of the conversation or further back in the thought process is going to change the outcome for meaningful numbers of ex-offenders?
Well, what we know
That's a long question, but...
but it really goes to the heart of the issue. What we know is this, is that the longer a prospective employer has an opportunity to look a person in the eyes, look at their background, consider the whole of their life, their skills, their abilities, as opposed to merely their criminal record, the more of an opportunity they have to truly compete for a job. At the end of the day, this legislation at its heart represents an effort to get people before prospective employers as three-dimensional people, not two-dimensional records. At the end of the day, it's not merely about one offense or one arrest. And I want to note that here. 1 out of every 4 adults has a criminal record, 65 million Americans, most of whom have not spent a day in jail, not spent a day in prison, not guilty of a felony or violent act. Many of these people have merely been arrested or been convicted of relatively minor nonviolent crimes. And so this legislation really moves people who are often in the shadows or on the periphery of the employment process into the middle of the process.
My question is, was this a compromise because it's the best you could get, or do you really think this is better than, say, either an outright ban or in certain categories of jobs saying there are requirements that prohibit the consideration of criminal records, others might be different? I mean, is this a compromise, or is this really, you think, the best way to approach this?
We honestly believe, based upon research, based upon a survey of the 50 jurisdictions in this country that have ban-the-box policies, based upon a survey of the nation's leading employers who already have corporate ban-the-box policies, Procter & Gamble, Prudential, Walmart, Starbucks, leading corporate brands that already have this kind of a policy. Based upon such a survey, we believe that this legislation really represents the best of what we've seen coast to coast.
Eric, it doesn't represent that to you. What is it that you, representing fuel merchants, representing the electricians, what is it that you look at when you see this bill?
Well, Sandy, Cornell points out some of the very large employers that have voluntarily undertaken a ban-the-box program. The distinction between them and the small business owners that we represent is very simple. They're Fortune 500 companies where their employees work at a central location. An HVAC contractor or an electrical contractor, day in and day out, send employees to your home and into your home. And I think that that's a distinction that the legislature needs to take into account when looking at this bill, that this bill does not take into account. Cornell talks about the 65 million Americans with an arrest record of some sort, and there's certainly all different issues relative to some employers ask about an arrest, some about convictions, some about felonies, and I think there might be room for a discussion there, but while 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 Americans might have an arrest record, there's not that many that are felons, and relative to the small businesses that are sending people to homes and into homes on a daily basis, it's that threshold, and we can get into the specifics of the bill later on if you like, that is the most concerning to us.
Dave, how large a part of the process of dealing with people who are ex-offenders who've had drug problems is this process of opening the corporate door, or at least opening employment doors further than they're open now?
Well, I mean, to get right to the point, understanding the process of treatment and recovery, it's not like a 30-day process or a 3-month process. It's more of a 5-year process of lifestyle change. So you can, and part of the process, a big part, is finding some kind of secure employment, schooling, somewhere to go when your head's on right and you've finished.
But let me interrupt you for a moment there, Dave, because you have said to me, the job is not the answer, because the job will only give the addict, the alcoholic, the money to buy the drugs and the alcohol. So should there be, you like this ban-the-box.
Yes.
And yet it seems to me that if you're talking about people who've not gone through the process, this multi-year process that you talk about, maybe Eric's got a point when he says they're less reliable and not as good a chance.
Well, the disease of addiction changes behavior. And since a lot of the drugs are illegal, they need money and they don't have the money for these drugs. They commit crimes and they become a criminal, many because of the addiction rather than because of, inherent criminality. I mean...
But whatever the reason, are they a worse bit? A worse chance for an employer to take? And if so, is this whole argument conflicting interests between, on one hand, the need to do something about the enormous problem of recidivism, and on the other hand, the need for business to protect itself from people who are not a good risk?
Interesting answer to that. First off, as an employer, and I was head of integrity for 4 decades, most of my people were recovering addicts with felony records or misdemeanor records. So I took a chance with them. And not only that, but I didn't take a chance. I hired them because of their ability and to see people, to read people, and to use all that creativity that they had on the streets to turn it around and become a tremendously effective peer counselor. That's, I think, a key issue that I used in, I didn't hire people because I had to. I hired because I wanted to. These people were extraordinary. And the other thing is, our record with employers has been very positive. They know that we follow up. They know that we send people who have been through this, and the people we send have tremendous capability. You know,
Okay, but Cornell, this bill would not be limited to people who've gone through an extraordinary program like Integrity.
Well, I think it's important to be clear about one thing. This piece of legislation is called the New Jersey Opportunity to Compete Act for a reason. It focuses on providing people with literally an opportunity to compete for work. In the process of securing a job, you simply ask to be evaluated based on merit, based on your skills and abilities. So it does not matter that that every one of the 65 million Americans who has a criminal record is a superior employee or prospective employee or subpar prospective employee. What matters is that you as an individual have the opportunity to compete for work and to saddle this question of giving people a fair chance at employment with solving the recidivism problem, solving the addiction problem, solving the criminal justice problem is simply not fair.
But aren't you saying you're matching a population of people which contains many talented people, but who have a stigma? And some of the reaction to that stigma is irrational. They're criminals, we won't buy them. And you're trying to change the way that decision is made. Why is it that there isn't a discourse about a more complex process where you try to find ways? For example, do you discount Eric saying, I'd be concerned as a small businessman to send somebody far away from my headquarters into a building where there are other people or into people's homes, as opposed to working with people who are under my direct supervision? Are those irrational concerns?
They're not irrational concerns. And in fact, I share Eric's concern. I agree with the fundamental assumption in his point, namely that employers have the right and the responsibility to choose the people who are best qualified for the job, that safeguard their customers, that safeguard their reputation. I absolutely believe that. And in fact, under federal law and federal guidance, the EEOC's guidance, employers have every right and the responsibility to consider the crime and the job, the responsibilities of the job. But what I think is really important to focus on here is that people should have the opportunity to compete. Think about this. We have people with 15, 20, 30-year-old convictions for minor crimes, even arrest.
Right, but Cornell, those are not the only people who would be covered by this legislation. And I'm wondering, Eric, I know you're anxious to get back in here. So go ahead.
I want to address one point of Cornell's, one point of Ray's, because Ray used the word stigma. And we have passed, and rightfully so as a society, Title VII of the entire Civil Rights Act of 1964, but specifically Title VII, what we're here discussing today, and have amended it over the years to address things that people were discriminated against based on stigma. Conviction of a crime or a felony is not a stigma that is based on race, gender, sexual orientation, anything of that sort. It's an action that you freely have taken. To Cornell's point relative to the EEOC, this bill goes well beyond the EEOC guidance. First of all, the EEOC can only issue guidance. They do not have regulatory power. That's something that Congress has chosen to never give the EEOC. This bill goes well beyond the EEOC. Title VII applies to employers with 15 or more. This bill applies to employers with 5 or more. And most importantly, not only in the EEOC guidance, but in case law through the years, the definition of business necessity, allowing the business owner to determine what is in their business necessity, is left with the business owner. This bill, for the first time, takes it out of the business owner's hand and paternalistically substitutes the legislature's idea of what the business owner should do. That is something that the EEOC guidance does not, let alone the sanctions that are in this from a civil perspective.
That's not an accurate statement of either the bill or the EEOC guidance. The fact of the matter is this bill allows employers to do what they've always done, which is to choose the very best people for the job, first of all. Secondly, with respect to the employers that are covered, whether they have 5 employees or 10 employees or 15 employees, the state of Massachusetts has a ban-the-box law which applies to employers as small as 5. So the federal government does not limit the ability of states to respond to their
But
problems.
Massachusetts lets me ask the question during the interview. It doesn't prescribe the question the way that this bill does.
Also, let me again make the point that we made in the tape piece and that Raymond made in his first question, and that is that ultimately the employer does get the opportunity to ask the question and look at the record. That's not good enough?
Well, the concern is what happens if the employer refuses to hire that applicant, and then that employer faces a suit under the law against discrimination, and you can check the Garrity case. The Supreme Court has made that very clear. And there's actually a case now that's being briefed at the Supreme Court, the Perez case on, of all things, a liquor store application that under the New Jersey Civil Rights Act would because we're enshrining this right statutorily, would then apply. So employers have far more liability than just the negligent hiring liability that proponents of the bill have talked about. And employers is opened up to a lot more liability, especially because it's in the findings and declarations of the bill, and both the Civil Rights Act and the law against discrimination have been read and continue to be read expansively by the courts, and they say that time and again when they
Any of that concern you, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, well, again, my issue is allowing people in my jurisdiction, alcohol, drugs, mental health issues, to become
And most of the people who are released and going to be looking for drugs have some history of substance abuse.
All of the people, well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the data, Christie himself said something like 43% are drug and alcohol, but I've heard 70, 80%. I mean, they're coming out anyway. They have to work. They have to get a job. If they don't get a job, part of their recovery is destroyed, and they will find ways to get money, and those ways become illegal. So I think it's very critical, this issue, what we're talking about is very critical, to figure out, to understand the reality of the need for jobs as part of people's redemption or recovery. And without it, you wind up making a silly decision and wind up causing more crime because these people don't have work.
Cornell, if this bill goes into effect 5 years down the road, would you predict a significant increase in the hiring or the employability of ex-offenders measurable by some empirical evidence?
Well, 2 responses. We don't need a crystal ball here. All we need to do is look at the history. With respect to...
That sounds like yes.
Yes. With respect to the Minnesota and Minneapolis statute...
Got 90 seconds, Cornell. So.
There was an uptick in the number of people with criminal records who were able to land work, number 1. Number 2, in terms of Eric's point, will this open the door to litigation? All we need to do is look across this country at the 5 states, 50 jurisdictions, going back to the state of Hawaii.
Okay, answer. Do you say no?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's no record of a wave of litigations. There's no record of a wave of administrative complaints. All one need do is call the EEOC. All one need do is check with the jurisdictions around the country.
Right. And if you look at the 6 other states that have statutes, 4 of them, the bill only applies to public employers. Massachusetts allows you to ask the question during the interview process, and Hawaii establishes a rational relationship that allows the employer to...
For small employers, would you accept any limitations on the use of criminal records?
I think that David raises a very interesting point. It's a point that the governor had made over a year ago.
Got 30 seconds there.
30 seconds.
A point made relative to to rehabilitation in drug offenses, and that I think that there's a compromise to be found here relative to, employers that send people into people's homes and looking at a bright line between felony convictions, and this might get into the issue in terms of how
Okay,
you
let's
met out
not
drug
get into
from
the
there,
issue
but
because I want to know real fast from each of you, is it going to pass?
don't know. I don't have Cornell's crystal ball.
Cornell?
I believe it absolutely will
Dave?
pass.
I have no idea.
Well, on that note, that's where we've got to stop the conversation. But the challenge of reentry, that will continue. My thanks to our guests and to all of you for watching. We hope you'll join us again next week and every week.
And visit our website at dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu for on-demand viewing of all 17 years of Due Process. For Sandy, Associate Producer Tanya Ivanova, and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. See you next time.
Well, I think that if you do the scholarship and you take the time to understand the legislation, I think you find that it's very compatible with what most corporations do today. Secondly, to their credit, the Institute, Sandy and others, Senator Cunningham and others, have reached out to the business community to build the bill. It reflects a lot of the best practices that we already see in New Jersey's corporate structure. So I'm not too concerned about it being a hard sell. I think business people are pretty sensitive to social issues. That's not always understood, but they are. And this happens to be the right thing. And fairness is always a good place to start an advocacy program.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.